Let's say you injure yourself training a calisthenics skill such as the handstand, front lever, back lever, etc. What should you do? Most likely you don't have an experienced coach to guide you along your recovery process, and seeing a physical therapist can be needlessly time-consuming and expensive. So you turn to your next best option, the internet. There's a ton of information about injuries on the internet, and it's overwhelming. After all, there's many different sports that can cause the same injury, and it's often difficult to find a specific solution for your injury. My goal is to explain the general injury recovery process and share some tips for injury prevention. Going back to the earlier example, you injured yourself but don't know what kind of injury it is, let alone how to treat it. This is where the first step in the injury recovery process comes in: diagnosis. Study your injury. Where does it hurt? Did it occur suddenly, or did you notice it over time? What kinds of movements cause pain? These types of questions will help you understand what kind of injury you have. For example, let's say you have a stinging pain on the inside of your elbow. It's gotten worse over the last several workouts, and it feels especially painful while you're doing chin-ups. If you compile your symptoms and paste them into a Google search, you'll probably come up with a diagnosis of golfer's elbow, an overuse injury where the tendon on the inside of your elbow gets inflamed and weak. However, sometimes the injury isn't so easy to diagnose. Say you injure your shoulder while doing high pull-ups, like me. There's a ton of muscles and connective tissues that make up the shoulder and are involved in the same movements. This can make it hard to diagnose the injury down to a single muscle or tendon. Fortunately, it usually isn't necessary to understand exactly which muscle or tendon is injured. Rather, it's more useful to take a function-oriented approach. What movements are most affected by your injury, and at what intensities? In the high pull-up example, my shoulder felt unstable in most pulling and pushing movements. I also noticed pain in exercises that involved external rotation of the shoulder. However, the pain was not equal throughout the entire range of motion. I felt less pain in the externally rotated ROM and more pain in the internally rotated ROM. I speculate that the reason for this has to do with the exercise that caused my injury. During high pull-ups, my shoulders were relatively internally rotated, especially in the top range of motion where the exercise transitions from pulling to pushing. If I injured myself in an internally rotated range of motion, it makes the most sense that the pain is most serious in that same range of motion. Therefore, my diagnosis for this injury is a general rotator cuff injury where the pain is greatest during internal rotation. That's all. From here, you can develop a basic roadmap to recovery. In the case of golfer's elbow, this injury doesn't have a fixed recovery time. For some people, it only takes several weeks of careful training to recover. For others, it could take years to get back to full capacity. In my case, it took 1.5 years to feel like I was fully recovered. My injury wasn't severe, but it definitely wasn't simple. I got golfer's elbow and ulnar nerve snapping on my right arm, then golfer's elbow on my left arm, then tennis elbow on both arms, and then brachioradialis pain in both arms. Let's look at my initial approach to recovering my elbows and then what I would have done instead. Once I noticed that my golfer's elbow was serious, I stopped training for 2 weeks. This is not a very optimal approach to recovery, as controlled movement is more useful than rest to heal an injury. See this video for a more in-depth explanation. Rather than just rest, I should have tested what exercises feel good and bad. For example, a bodyweight pull-up might hurt, but does a bodyweight dead hang hurt? What about band-assisted pull-ups or dead hangs? Wrist curls and deviations? Wrist push-ups? From here, I could have made a daily routine for recovery. My first ever prehabilitation routine was wrist curls with 3-pound dumbbells, starting at 15 reps per set and eventually reaching more than 50 reps. Later in my recovery process, I did dead hangs 2 to 3 times per day for around 30 seconds at a time. And right now, my routine is to do false grip hangs for 2 to 3 sets of 30 to 45 seconds, 3 times per week. Notice how the intensity increased from wrist curls with 3-pound dumbbells to bodyweight dead hangs to false grip hangs. At this point, I need to make an important distinction. Many of you might walk away from this video thinking that to cure your golfer's elbow, all you need to do is some wrist curls and some hanging. But what most of you will find is that wrist curls and hanging will hurt your elbows. And then you'll complain to me saying that my prehabilitation routine was dog water. This is why I need to introduce 2 concepts: bad pain and good pain. Bad pain is when the affected area experiences pain and it gets worse. For example, your elbow hurts, then you decide to do heavy weighted pull-ups, and then your elbow hurts more. This is bad pain because the exercise you chose, heavy weighted pull-ups, caused the pain to get worse. On the other hand, good pain is where you still experience pain, but it becomes a little bit less painful. This is what you should experience when doing a properly programmed prehabilitation routine. You might feel a little pain when doing your light movements, but you'll find that during your workout or even during your set, that pain will reduce in magnitude. In essence, the goal of your prehabilitation routine should be to maximize good pain, and the goal of your training routine should be to minimize bad pain. The second thing I did wrong was decrease my pulling frequency from once every 3 days to once every 4 days. Like I said before, movement is often better than rest when it comes to injury recovery. In addition to the daily prehabilitation routine that I wasn't doing, I should have found a way to train without aggravating my injuries. For example, instead of bodyweight pull-ups, I could have done band-assisted pull-ups with a slower rep speed. Or if the injury was too severe, I could have switched movement patterns entirely to lat pull-downs, dumbbell pullovers, resistance band pull-aparts, rows, or any other pulling exercise that wouldn't aggravate my injury. The third thing I did wrong was not progressive overload. Basically, I would train tuck front levers, pull-ups, and rows once every 4 days for 3 sets to failure on each exercise. By fixing the volume, intensity, and relative intensity of all my exercises, not to mention the low training frequency, I ended up not making much progress for months. Not only that, but training to failure on front levers, pull-ups, and rows all on the same day isn't exactly easy on the elbows. So ironically, the low pulling frequency made my recovery process take longer, and perhaps even contributed to me getting tennis elbow and brachioradialis pain later on. As for the shoulder injury, which was more recent, here's how I recovered. Firstly, after noticing the discomfort in my shoulder, I actually did 2 more working sets of muscle ups since I thought it wasn't that serious. But by then, the pain was getting worse, and I realized that I could be out of commission for a significant period of time. So I went home and had my pity party, eating a cheat meal and listening to sad music. But I also tried to understand my injury. So throughout the day and during my next training sessions, I tested various movements to see what felt good and what felt bad. I learned that my muscles could still produce a lot of force, but it felt like my shoulders were not able to transmit that force. So I started with very low intensity training. Instead of pull-ups, I did band lat pull-downs, and instead of handstand push-ups, I did knee push-ups. I also worked on strengthening my rotator cuff with band exercises. Interestingly, doing regular face pulls didn't help that much, since these only loaded the rotator cuff in an externally rotated range of motion. But Cuban rotations and sideways external rotations did help, since they trained the range of motion that I felt weaker in. It took me almost a week before I did my first bodyweight pull-up again, and a full month before I felt pretty much recovered. Throughout this whole process, I avoided exercises that worsened my injury, such as muscle-ups or heavy weighted pull-ups, and I gradually strengthened and desensitized my rotator cuff in the internally rotated range of motion. Now that we've covered the general process of recovering from an injury, let's talk about prevention. What caused your injury, and what can you do to prevent it from happening again? In the case of acute injuries, such as the rotator cuff example, potential causes could be acute, such as improper warm-up, bad sleep, high stress levels, or carelessness. In the high pull-up example, I only got 5 to 6 hours of sleep the night before my session, and I didn't warm up my rotator cuff sufficiently. Also, I was overexerting myself because 1, I had taken pre-workout before my session, and 2, there were some girls next to me. These 2 factors caused me to pull up with too much effort, if that makes sense. So I basically did maximal effort high pull-ups with poor sleep, a bad warm-up, and being overstimulated from caffeine and females. Besides acute factors, injuries can also be caused by an accumulation of mistakes over a period of time. An example of this is training too high intensities for too high frequencies. This was one of the causes of my elbow tendonitis, where I trained front lever negatives and assisted one-arm pull-ups once every 2 to 3 days. Another injury risk is training improper form for a long period of time, such as doing dips and pull-ups with elevated shoulders, not controlling the negative of a movement, etc. And thirdly, improper fatigue management. After several weeks of hard training, your fatigue goes up, which can decrease performance and increase injury risk. In the high pull-up example, I injured myself in the final week of my mesocycle, when fatigue was at its highest. Understanding the various causes of injury can help you recognize your injury risk before each workout session and plan accordingly to stay safe. Anyways, that's all I really wanted to talk about when it comes to injury prevention and management as a calisthenics athlete. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff I didn't cover, so feel free to comment any advice regarding this topic down below. Thanks guys.